The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy, almost suffocating. Not a single person dared to move or whisper, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and freshly printed papers, but underneath it was the sharp scent of tension. At the center of it all stood Charles Whitmore, a man whose very name commanded fear, respect, and attention. Charles was no ordinary businessman. He was one of the wealthiest men in the state, a billionaire who had built his empire on steel, construction, and ruthless determination. His tall frame, sharp jawline, and expensive tailored suit gave him an almost royal presence. To the outside world, Charles Whitmore was untouchable, a man whose wealth shielded him from scandal and whose voice could shape headlines overnight. But today, the courtroom saw a very different Charles. His face was red with fury, his eyes flashing with indignation, and his voice boomed across the room as he pointed an accusing finger at a woman seated quietly at the defendant's table. "That woman," he roared, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and self-righteousness, "is guilty of the worst kind of betrayal. She laid her hands on my daughter. She abused my child." A gasp spread through the courtroom, like a sudden gust of wind sweeping across dry leaves. Heads turned instantly toward the accused woman. Her name was Martha Johnson, and unlike Charles, she was no figure of power or prestige. She was a black maid, middle-aged, dressed modestly in a plain blouse and skirt. Her skin carried the marks of years of hard work, her hands roughened by endless cleaning, scrubbing, and serving. For 8 long years, Martha had worked in the Whitmore mansion, cleaning its endless rooms, polishing its marble floors, and tending to the needs of a family that rarely noticed her sacrifices. Now, she sat in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her head slightly bowed, not in shame, but in pain. Her deep, tired eyes revealed a truth her lips had not yet spoken. She had not committed the crime she was accused of. Martha Johnson, Charles continued, his voice now echoing off the wooden panels of the courtroom, was trusted in my home. She was hired to serve, to look after my household. And what did she do? She abused my only child, my innocent daughter, Lily. This woman should never be allowed near another child again. The words were like daggers piercing Martha's heart. Each sentence twisted deeper into her soul. She wanted to shout, to defend herself, to scream that she had never once harmed Lily. But her throat felt heavy, and her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I would never hurt her," Martha said softly, shaking her head. Her words were drowned by the storm of murmurs filling the courtroom. For years, Martha had been more than just a maid in the Whitmore mansion. She had been a second mother to Lily. She had been the one who sang lullabies when the little girl was afraid of the dark. She had been the one who braided her hair before school, who bandaged her scraped knees, who listened when no one else had time. And now, in one swift moment, all of that was being stripped away. The judge, a stern-faced man with gray hair and tired eyes, banged his gavel to silence the courtroom. "Order," he commanded. Slowly, the chatter died down, but the tension only grew heavier. The jury leaned forward in their seats, their faces a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Some looked at Charles with admiration, as if convinced by his sheer confidence. Others glanced at Martha with pity, unsure of what to believe. But one thing was clear: this was no ordinary trial. This was a battle between wealth and poverty, between power and vulnerability, between a billionaire whose voice shook the city and a maid whose only weapon was the truth. Martha sat still, her hands trembling in her lap. She thought of her children at home, waiting for her. She thought of her youngest son, who looked up to her with eyes full of hope. What would happen to them if she were found guilty? Who would take care of them if she was taken away? Her heart pounded in her chest. Fear coursed through her veins, but so did something else, a quiet strength, a dignity that even this trial could not steal. She knew she was innocent, She knew she had done nothing but love Lily with all the care a child deserved. Yet here she was, painted as a monster by the very man whose family she had served faithfully for almost a decade. Charles's lawyers stood confidently beside him, their suits gleaming, their briefcases stacked with documents. They looked at Martha as though she were already guilty, as though this trial was nothing more than a formality. With Charles's influence, they believed the verdict was inevitable, but Martha's lawyer, a young, nervous man with little experience, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Stay strong," he whispered. "The truth will come out." Martha gave him a weak nod. She wanted to believe him, but deep down, she feared the truth might not be enough. She knew how the world worked. She knew how often people like her, poor, black, and powerless, were crushed beneath the weight of lies spun by the rich and powerful. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment after Charles's outburst. Every eye was fixed on Martha, waiting for her to break, to cry, to confess to a crime she hadn't committed. But Martha sat with her back straight, her chin lifted ever so slightly. Her silence spoke louder than words. It said she would not crumble, not yet. The judge cleared his throat. "This court will hear both sides," he announced. "But let it be clear, this is a serious accusation. The well-being of a child is at stake." A chill swept through the room. Everyone knew that child abuse cases were among the most serious charges one could face. If Martha was found guilty, her life would be destroyed. No job, no freedom, no future. Charles adjusted his tie, his lips curling into a smirk. He thought he had already won. He thought his wealth and influence would bury Martha beneath layers of lies. But what Charles didn't know was that the very person he claimed to protect, the one whose name he used to condemn Martha, would soon be the one to reveal the truth. For now, though, the court only saw a billionaire pointing fingers and a maid fighting tears. The tension was unbearable, the stakes impossibly high, and the entire courtroom waited, breathless, for what would come next. Martha Johnson sat quietly at the defendant's table, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her skirt. To the outside world, she was just another maid, another worker who slipped in and out of wealthy households, cleaning up the messes no one else wanted to acknowledge. But to those who knew her, Martha was far more than that. She was a woman of resilience, a woman who had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders and still managed to walk with dignity. Her journey had never been easy. Born into poverty, Martha learned early what sacrifice meant. Her childhood had been stripped of luxuries, replaced with long days of chores and nights of hunger. Yet from the very beginning, she carried within her a quiet determination to build a better life, not just for herself, but for the children she dreamed of raising one day. That dream became her reality when she had her own family. A daughter and two sons filled her small home with laughter, joy, and sometimes even tears. Martha's husband, however, had not stayed. He left when life became too heavy, leaving Martha to carry the responsibility of raising their children alone. With no education beyond high school and no inheritance to lean on, she knew she had to work twice as hard to keep food on the table. It was during those desperate years that she found employment with the Whitmore family. To Martha, the opportunity felt like a lifeline. Charles Whitmore, the billionaire businessman, had offered her a job as a maid in his enormous mansion. The pay was higher than anything she had ever earned. It was enough to keep her youngest son in school, enough to buy groceries without worrying about skipping meals, enough to pay the rent on time. But what Martha hadn't expected was the bond she would form with little Lily Whitmore, Charles's daughter. From the moment Martha stepped into the mansion, she noticed the silence that echoed through its long, marble hallways. It was the kind of silence that came not from peace, but from neglect. Lily, barely 6 years old at the time, often wandered through the house alone, clutching a small teddy bear to her chest. Her parents, Charles and his glamorous wife, were rarely present. They were always caught up in board meetings, charity galas, or exotic vacations. Martha quickly became the presence that Lily longed for. She was the one who knelt down to tie the little girl's shoelaces. She was the one who patiently brushed her golden hair each morning before school. She was the one who listened when Lily talked about her dreams, her fears, or even the silly things children love to imagine. Over time, Martha became more than a maid. She became Lily's comforter, protector, and friend. When Lily had nightmares, it was Martha who crept into her room, whispering lullabies and assuring her that monsters weren't real. When Lily was sick, it was Martha who sat by her bedside, wiping sweat from her forehead and feeding her soup spoon by spoon. When Lily came home with a scraped knee, it was Martha who knelt down with bandages, kissing the wound gently before covering it in a house filled with riches. Lily had no shortage of toys or clothes. But what she truly craved was love, and it was Martha who provided it. Yet, despite all her sacrifices, Martha's position in the household was still that of a servant. She knew her place. She knew she could never cross the invisible line between employer and employee. She was a maid, nothing more. And though Lily clung to her like family, Martha understood that the Whitmores would never see her as an equal. Behind her calm demeanor, Martha carried silent struggles that no one else saw. She woke before dawn every day, packing lunches for her own children before rushing to the Whitmore mansion. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached, washed clothes until her fingers stung, and cooked meals she rarely got to taste. Her wages, though generous compared to other jobs, still barely stretched enough to cover her bills. More often than not, Martha went without new clothes or proper meals so her children could have them instead. There were nights she cried quietly into her pillow, exhausted, wondering if life would ever ease its grip. But by morning, she always rose again, ready to face another day. Her greatest strength was her love for her children and for Lily, who had become like a daughter to her. And yet, sitting in the courtroom now, accused of hurting the very child she had loved like her own, Martha felt as if the world had turned upside down. Her mind drifted back to the last time she had tucked Lily into bed. The little girl had smiled sleepily, wrapping her small arms around Martha's neck. "I wish you were my mommy," Lily had whispered, before drifting into sleep. The words had touched Martha so deeply that tears filled her eyes even now. How could that same child, the one who saw her as a mother figure, be used as a weapon against her? Martha's lawyer tried to remind the jury of her devotion. He spoke of her long years of service, of the trust she had earned in the Whitmore household. But against the polished voices of Charles's high-priced attorneys, his words seemed small, fragile, and easy to dismiss. The prosecution painted Martha as a woman filled with resentment, a servant who grew bitter over years of being overlooked, who finally snapped and lashed out at the child she was supposed to protect. They held up photographs of Lily's bruised arms as if they were irrefutable evidence of Martha's guilt. Martha listened in silence, her heart breaking. She wanted to scream the truth, that she had never once raised her hand against Lily, that those bruises came from somewhere else. But her voice felt trapped in her chest, weighed down by fear. She knew how the world often saw women like her. Poor, black, a maid in a rich man's house. It was easy for people to believe she could be cruel, because society rarely gave people like Martha the benefit of the doubt. Still, she refused to let despair consume her. She sat tall, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Inside, her heart was breaking, but she would not let Charles see her broken. Her thoughts returned to her children. She remembered the mornings her daughter, Tanya, begged her not to work so late. She remembered the nights her youngest son, Caleb, cried for her when she couldn't be there to tuck him in. She remembered the sacrifices she had made for them, the shoes she never bought for herself, the vacations she never took, the dreams she quietly buried. Everything Martha had ever done was for love. And yet, here she was, accused of violence. The irony was unbearable. She, who had spent her life protecting children, now stood accused of harming one. But deep down, Martha held on to one truth. Lily knew the reality. The little girl knew she had never been harmed by Martha. And Martha prayed, with every fiber of her being, that Lily would be brave enough to tell the world the truth. For now, though, she endured in silence, her struggle invisible to most. To the jury, she was just a maid on trial. To the world, she was just another name in a courtroom scandal. But in her heart, she knew she was more. She was a mother, a protector, a fighter, and though her voice was quiet, her spirit refused to break. The courtroom, though packed with spectators, felt like it belonged to one man alone, Charles Whitmore. His mere presence dominated the space. He wasn't just another wealthy businessman sitting in a trial. He was a billionaire whose empire spanned across industries. The walls seemed to bend toward him. The jury's eyes followed him, and even the air shifted when he spoke. That was the power of influence. Charles had spent his entire life cultivating not only wealth but authority, the kind of authority that made people hesitate before questioning him. His companies employed thousands, his donations funded political campaigns, and his name appeared on hospitals, universities, and museums. To the public, Charles Whitmore wasn't just a man. He was a symbol of success, of power, of the American dream come to life. And now, that same power was being weaponized against a single woman, Martha Johnson. The lawyers of Power Charles's legal team was a force to be reckoned with. 5 men in sleek, custom-tailored suits sat beside him, their ties sharp, their hair slicked back. Each of them had decades of experience in high-profile cases, men who charged thousands of dollars for a single hour of their time. They were not just lawyers. They were gladiators in $1,000 armor. Their weapons were loopholes, polished words, and carefully spun narratives. They had prepared for weeks, combing through every detail of Martha's life, searching for anything they could twist into evidence against her. One of them, a man named Gregory Stone, stood and addressed the jury. His voice was calm, smooth, and rehearsed. He painted a picture of Martha not as a hard-working woman, but as someone who secretly harbored resentment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gregory began, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Imagine spending years in the shadow of unimaginable wealth. Imagine working day after day, serving a family who barely noticed your existence. Can we truly be surprised that such resentment might boil over? That it might take form in violence?" The jury leaned forward, listening. Some nodded slightly. Gregory's words sliced through Martha's heart like a knife. They weren't just calling her an abuser. They were questioning her very humanity. They were suggesting that her race, her poverty, her struggles had twisted her into a bitter woman capable of harming a child. And Charles sat smugly, his eyes scanning the jury, confident that his money had already won this battle. The evidence that wasn't he photographs of Lily's bruised arm were held up, passed around, shown to the jury on large screens. The images were painful to look at. The purple marks on the child's fair skin drew gasps from the spectators. Charles's lawyers seized on the opportunity. "This," Gregory declared, pointing at the photo, "is not an accident. These marks are evidence of cruelty. Evidence of betrayal from a woman who was supposed to protect an innocent child." He let the words hang in the air, heavy and condemning. Martha's own lawyer, a young man named Daniel, tried to argue. He pointed out that no one had actually seen Martha hurt Lily. He reminded the court that Martha had worked in the household for nearly 8 years without a single complaint. He spoke of her kindness, her dedication, her devotion to Lily. But Daniel's voice was small compared to the booming authority of Charles's team. His inexperience showed in the way his hands trembled slightly, in the way his arguments were drowned out by polished rebuttals. Whenever Daniel made a point, Charles's lawyers struck it down like thunder chasing away the rain. The weight of reputation. What made things worse was Charles's reputation. The jury didn't just see a father, they saw the Charles Whitmore. They saw the man who built skyscrapers, who graced the covers of business magazines, who mingled with politicians and celebrities. His reputation wasn't just in the courtroom. It hovered over every person inside, shaping their thoughts, pressuring their decisions. It was almost unthinkable to imagine such a man lying. Why would he? What could he gain by accusing his maid? To the jury, it seemed unlikely. On the other hand, Martha was just Martha, a maid, a woman most people wouldn't notice if she walked past them in the street. She didn't own companies. She didn't dine with presidents. Her name wasn't on hospital wings or charity boards. Many. It seemed easier to believe Charles's words over hers. Martha felt it in every glance the jury gave her, in the whispers that rippled through the spectators. She was already guilty in their eyes, not because of evidence, but because of the imbalance of power. The billionaire's performance. Charles didn't just rely on his lawyers. He knew how to perform. Years of boardrooms, interviews, and public appearances had trained him to control his tone, his body language, his very image. When he spoke of Lily, his voice cracked ever so slightly, just enough to tug at emotions. He wiped away a single tear at the perfect moment. He called her my precious little girl again and again, emphasizing his role as the devoted father to the public. It was convincing. To the jury, it was moving. But to Martha, it was unbearable. She knew the truth. She had seen the moments behind the curtain, the shouting, the anger, the rough grip of Charles's hand on Lily's arm. She had seen the fear in the little girl's eyes when her father raised his voice. And yet, here he was, acting as though he was the perfect parent, while she, the one who had comforted Lily during those very moments, was being painted as the villain. The silence of fear. Martha's greatest pain came from her inability to defend herself fully. Every time she wanted to speak, to tell the court about the bruises that came from Charles himself, her lawyer advised her to stay quiet. "We don't have evidence," Daniel whispered. "Without proof, it will just look like desperation. Let's wait." So she waited. And with every passing moment, Charles's influence grew heavier. The newspapers already ran stories that morning with headlines like, "Billionaire father bravely fights for justice and Maid accused of heinous act against child." Reporters scribbled every word Charles said, while Martha's protests were barely noted. Even outside the courtroom, Charles's influence stretched like an invisible hand. Strangers whispered about Martha in grocery stores. Neighbors looked at her family with suspicion. Her children came home from school with tears in their eyes after classmates repeated what they had heard on the news. It was as though the world had already judged her, because Charles Whitmore had spoken. The crushing weight. Martha sat there, her body still but her heart raging inside. She wanted to shout, to rip apart the lies being spun around her. She wanted to look every juror in the eye and say, "I love that girl like my own. I would never hurt her." But the weight of Charles's influence pressed down like a boulder on her chest. She thought of Lily in that moment, the child who trusted her, who once whispered, "I wish you were my mommy." That memory gave Martha strength, even as the walls seemed to close in around her. She realized that no matter how powerful Charles seemed, no matter how convincing his lawyers were, the truth still existed. And the truth was on her side. But truth, she knew too well, did not always win against power. Still, she clung to a fragile hope. That Lily, the one person who truly knew, would find the courage to speak. For now, though, the courtroom belonged to Charles. His influence filled every corner, every silence, every glance. And Martha sat alone, a woman drowning in the shadow of a billionaire's power, waiting for the storm to break. The tension in the courtroom had reached its peak. Martha sat motionless, her hands clenched tightly together, her eyes fixed on the polished wood of the table before her. She could hear the whispers around her, feel the weight of the jury's doubtful stares, and sense the confidence radiating from Charles Whitmore and his team of lawyers. It felt like the world was closing in on her. Then, the judge's voice broke through the silence. This court will now hear testimony from the most crucial witness in this case, Miss Lily Whitmore. A collective gasp echoed through the room. The child, the one at the center of this storm. The large double doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and all eyes turned. Slowly, a small figure entered, clutching a worn-out teddy bear tightly against her chest. Lily Whitmore, the billionaire's only daughter, walked down the long aisle, her little shoes tapping against the floor, each step sounding louder than the last in the hushed courtroom. Her golden hair framed her delicate face, and her wide blue eyes darted nervously around the room. Though she was dressed neatly in a pale yellow dress, the innocence of childhood clung to her more strongly than any clothing could. She looked far too young, far too fragile, to carry the weight of such a case. Martha's heart clenched at the sight of her. She wanted to run to her, to hold her, to tell her it would be all right. But she couldn't. All she could do was watch as the little girl she had loved like her own was asked to speak before strangers, reporters, and, most terrifyingly, her father. Charles Whitmore leaned forward, his sharp features softening into an almost tender expression. He extended a hand toward Lily, though she didn't take it. "Sweetheart," he said gently, his voice dripping with rehearsed affection, "just tell them the truth. Tell them what that woman did to you." His words carried an unspoken command, one Lily understood all too well. Her little body stiffened, and she hugged her teddy bear closer. The jury leaned in. The spectators held their breath. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment when the child herself would confirm the story. Martha closed her eyes for a second, whispering a silent prayer. "Please, Lord, please let her speak the truth." The bailiff gently guided Lily to the witness stand. She climbed up carefully, her small legs barely reaching the floor once she was seated. The teddy bear remained clutched in her hands, as if it was the only source of courage she had left. The judge leaned forward kindly. "Miss Whitmore, do you understand why you're here today?" Lily nodded slowly. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecutor, one of Charles's high-priced lawyers, approached her with a smile. He crouched down to seem less intimidating, his voice soft and coaxing. "Lily, can you tell us what happened? Did Martha ever hurt you?" The room went silent. Every eye was on the little girl. Lily's lips trembled. Her eyes flickered from the lawyer to her father. Charles sat tall, his expression firm, his jaw clenched. Though he smiled faintly at his daughter, his gaze carried an unmistakable warning. "Say what I told you." Her eyes then drifted to Martha. The maid sat frozen, her face pale, her eyes filled with tears that hadn't yet fallen. She looked at Lily not with expectation, but with love, a love that had never asked for anything in return. That look seemed to give Lily strength. She took a shaky breath, her voice still trembling, but louder now. "She didn't hurt me." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted from the gallery. The prosecutor froze, his smile faltering. Charles's face darkened, his hand clenching the armrest of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The prosecutor cleared his throat, trying to recover. "Sweetheart, maybe you're confused. Think carefully. Did Martha ever grab you too hard? Did she make those bruises on your arm?" Lily shook her head firmly this time. Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice grew stronger. "No, Martha never hurt me. She takes care of me. She's the only one who does." Whispers rippled through the courtroom again, louder this time. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked, the tension rising like a storm. Lily's small hands clutched the teddy bear tighter as she continued. "The bruises, they weren't from Martha." She paused, her voice cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. Then, with all the courage her little body could muster, she said the words that would change everything. "They were from my father." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, and stunned cries filled the air. The judge banged his gavel furiously. Order! Order in the court! But no amount of gavel banging could silence the shock that had just shaken the room. Charles shot to his feet, his face turning red. "That's a lie," he thundered, his voice booming. "She doesn't know what she's saying. She's just a child. She's confused." But his words sounded desperate, unpolished, nothing like the calm performance he had delivered earlier. For the first time, the mask of control slipped, revealing the anger simmering underneath. Lily flinched at his voice, shrinking into her seat, but she didn't take back her words. Her bravery, though wrapped in trembling hands and tear-streaked cheeks, stood firm. Martha, unable to hold back her emotions any longer, covered her face with her hands as tears streamed freely. She had prayed for the truth to be spoken, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined Lily would find the courage to speak against her own father. When order was finally restored, the judge leaned forward, his voice softer now. "Lily, are you certain about what you just said? Are you telling this court that your father caused those bruises?" The little girl wiped her tears with the back of her hand and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. He gets angry sometimes. He yells a lot. And when he yells, he grabs me too hard." Her voice cracked again, but she continued bravely. "Martha always tried to protect me. She told me to forgive him. She said he didn't mean to. But he scared me. He scared me a lot." Her confession silenced the room completely. This was no longer about a maid accused of abuse. This was about the billionaire father himself, the man who had tried to bury the truth beneath wealth and lies. For the first time, the jury's eyes shifted. Doubt clouded their faces, doubt not about Martha, but about Charles. The man who had commanded respect and admiration moments earlier now looked smaller, weaker, exposed. His lawyers scrambled, whispering frantically among themselves. But no polished argument could erase the image of a trembling little girl admitting the truth in front of everyone. The press leaned forward eagerly, already sensing the story of the year unraveling before their eyes. Billionaire accuses Maid, but daughter exposes him in court. Martha lowered her hands from her face, her tears still flowing, but now they carried a glimmer of hope. She looked at Lily, who glanced back at her with a faint, fragile smile in that moment. No words were needed. Their bond spoke louder than any testimony. Lily had told the truth. And with that truth, the impossible tide of power in the courtroom had finally begun to turn. The courtroom sat in stunned silence after Lily's trembling words cut through the air like a blade. "She didn't hurt me. Martha never hurt me. The bruises, they were from my father." The little girl's voice was fragile, but it carried a weight no one in that room could ignore. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The whispers that had once condemned Martha now turned into gasps of shock, disbelief, and outrage. For a long moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped. Even the judge, who had sat through countless trials in his career, stared at Lily with wide eyes, struggling to process the revelation. And then, like a dam breaking, the room erupted. Reporters scrambled to capture every detail, their pens racing across notepads, cameras flashing like lightning strikes. Spectators whispered loudly to one another, their voices a mix of sympathy for Martha and disgust for Charles. The jury members exchanged glances, their expressions heavy with doubt, their once straight posture now slouched under the weight of the truth they had just heard. But amidst the storm, two figures stood out, the accuser and the accused. Charles Whitmore leapt to his feet, his face crimson with rage. The calm, composed billionaire image he had worn like a mask all day was gone. What remained was a man cornered, exposed, and furious. "She's lying," he roared, his voice shaking the walls of the courtroom. "My daughter doesn't know what she's saying. She's confused, manipulated, frightened." He jabbed a finger toward Martha, his hand trembling with fury. "That woman filled her head with lies. This is her doing. The judge slammed his gavel. Order. Mr. Whitmore, sit down. But Charles was beyond reason. He turned on his lawyers, his voice breaking. Do something. Don't just sit there. His lawyers exchanged nervous glances. For the first time, they looked rattled. They had built their entire case on the image of Charles as a protective father and Martha as the aggressor. But Lily's testimony had flipped the script in a single sentence. Their polished arguments suddenly felt hollow, and their expensive suits offered no shield from the child's truth. The billionaire's power was cracking, and everyone could see the defense table. Martha sat frozen, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her chest heaved with silent sobs, but they were not sobs of despair. They were sobs of release. For weeks, she had carried the unbearable weight of false accusations, knowing the truth but unable to prove it. Now, the truth had finally been spoken, not by lawyers, not by evidence, but by the very child she had protected for years. Martha pressed her hands to her face, whispering, "Thank you. God, thank you." Her lawyer, Daniel, leaned toward her, his own face pale with shock, but lit with hope. "This changes everything," he whispered. "Everything." Martha nodded through her tears, her heart swelling with love for Lily. The little girl had done something even grown adults struggled to do. She had stood up against fear, against power, against her own father. The gavel slammed again, this time harder. "Order in the court," the judge barked. His voice was stern, but there was a softness in his eyes when he looked at Lily. "Miss Whitmore," he said gently, "are you certain of what you're telling us? This is very serious. Are you saying that your father was the one who caused your injuries?" Lily sniffled, hugging her teddy bear tighter, but she nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Honor. He gets mad. He yells, and when he yells, he grabs me too hard. That's how I got the bruises." The judge's gaze lingered on her, searching for any sign of doubt. But what he saw was a child's raw, unfiltered honesty. Children could be coached to lie, yes, but they could not fake fear in their eyes. And Lily's eyes told the truth more loudly than her words ever could. The judge leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable, but the silence that followed carried the weight of his realization. The case had just taken a dramatic turn. The jury shifted in their seats, and for the first time since the trial began, their eyes softened when they looked at Martha. They no longer saw her as a potential abuser, but as a woman wronged, accused falsely, dragged into a battle she never deserved. One juror, a middle-aged mother herself, wiped away tears as she glanced at Martha. Another shook his head in disbelief, muttering under his breath. They had been ready to deliver a guilty verdict. Now, everything had changed. Charles's credibility was shattered, and the jury knew it. The billionaire who once commanded the room with his wealth and presence was now a man exposed as a liar, and possibly worse. Outside the courthouse, the news was already spreading like wildfire. Television anchors interrupted broadcasts to report the shocking twist. Headlines flashed across screens. "Billionaire exposed by his own daughter. Child testifies. Made innocent. Father guilty." The fall of Charles Whitmore. The story that Charles had tried to control was now spinning beyond his grasp, slipping through his fingers like sand. The world was no longer on his side. As the courtroom settled into silence again, Lily looked directly at Martha. Her small lips trembled into a faint smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough that Martha's tears flowed harder. She mouthed silently, "Thank you, baby." The little girl had done the unthinkable. She had stood against her own father to defend the woman who truly cared for her. It was an act of courage far beyond her years, and it moved everyone who witnessed it. The bond between Martha and Lily, forged in years of quiet love and care, had proven stronger than fear, stronger than lies, stronger than wealth. Charles sank back into his seat, his body trembling with anger and fear. For the first time in decades, he realized his money couldn't save him. His empire, built on power and intimidation, was crumbling in real time, destroyed not by rivals, not by scandals, but by the voice of his own child. He leaned forward, whispering harshly to his lawyers, "Fix this. Fix it." But the desperation in his voice betrayed him. Even his lawyers seemed to shrink under the weight of the truth. The mask of control, once his greatest weapon, was gone. All that remained was a father exposed before the world, his lies unraveling thread by thread. Martha straightened in her chair, wiping her tears, her heart swelling with both sorrow and relief. She hadn't asked for this fight. She hadn't asked to be dragged into a courtroom battle against one of the most powerful men in the city. But she had endured it with dignity, with quiet strength, and with the truth by her side. Now, the truth had spoken for her, and though the trial wasn't over yet, Martha knew in her soul that the tide had turned. The billionaire's accusations no longer held power. The lies no longer had teeth. The truth, once buried under wealth and influence, had risen, and it was shining brighter than ever. For the first time since the trial began, Martha allowed herself to breathe. And as she inhaled deeply, she whispered a promise in her heart. "I will walk out of this courtroom free. I will walk out with my head held high, and no one will ever break me again." The courtroom was no longer the same place it had been when the trial began. At first, it had felt like an arena where a wealthy man's words held more weight than truth, where Martha sat small and powerless against a giant. But now, after Lily's brave testimony, the air was different. For the first time, justice seemed possible. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his gaze fixed firmly on Charles Whitmore. His voice, calm but edged with steel, echoed through the courtroom. "Mr. Whitmore, the allegations your daughter has just made are grave. This court does not tolerate false testimony, nor does it tolerate the abuse of a child. You will remain silent until further inquiry." Charles's jaw tightened. He wanted to shout, to deny, to claw back control. But the eyes of everyone in that room, jury, press, even his own lawyers, were on him. The mask of the untouchable billionaire had shattered. The silence that followed was crushing, and for once, Charles Whitmore had no words to fill it. Hours passed. The prosecution scrambled, trying desperately to salvage their crumbling case, while the defense remained calm, letting Lily's testimony speak louder than any legal argument ever could. Finally, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The entire courtroom waited with bated breath as the hours ticked by. Martha sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, praying silently. Every second felt like an eternity. When the jury finally returned, the atmosphere grew so heavy that even breathing seemed difficult. The foreman stood, holding the slip of paper that carried Martha's fate. The judge nodded, and the man cleared his throat. "In the case of State versus Martha Johnson, we the jury find the defendant not guilty." The words rang through the courtroom like church bells that Martha's breath hitched. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the weight she had carried for weeks, for months, lifted at last. The courtroom erupted, some cheering, others gasping, reporters rushing to record the moment. But for Martha, everything faded into silence except the pounding of her heart. She was free. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing with relief. Daniel, her lawyer, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening. "You did it, Martha," he whispered. "You're free." But Martha shook her head, smiling through her tears. "No, Lily did it. She saved me." Her gaze drifted across the room to the little girl, who sat with her teddy bear clutched to her chest, looking both exhausted and relieved. For a moment, their eyes locked. Martha mouthed silently, "I love you." And Lily, with a small, weary smile, mouthed back, "I love you too." The joy of Martha's freedom was quickly overshadowed by the reality Charles now faced. The judge turned his gaze toward him. "Mr. Whitmore, in light of your daughter's testimony and the evidence we now have cause to investigate, This court is ordering an immediate inquiry into allegations of child abuse. Furthermore, your attempt to mislead this court with false accusations will not go unpunished. Charles's face drained of color. His lawyers whispered furiously, but the damage was done. The reporters pounced like wolves, cameras flashing as they shouted questions. Mr. Whitmore, did you abuse your daughter? Is it true you fabricated charges against your maid? Will this affect your business empire? Charles stormed out of the courtroom, pushing past reporters, but there was no escaping the truth. The once powerful billionaire now stood exposed, his reputation in tatters, his empire crumbling. For the first time, it wasn't his money that controlled the narrative. It was his daughter's courage. The chaos unfolded. Martha knelt down and opened her arms. Lily didn't hesitate. She rushed into them, burying her face in Martha's chest. The little girl trembled, the weight of her bravery finally catching up to her. I was so scared, she whispered. Martha stroked her golden hair, tears flowing freely. You were so brave, baby. You did something even adults couldn't do. You told the truth. And because of you, justice was served. Lily's small arms tightened around her. I don't want to go back with him. I want to stay with you. Martha's heart broke and healed all at once. She had always loved Lily like her own, but hearing those words sealed the bond forever. She kissed the top of Lily's head. You'll never be alone again. I promise. Outside the courthouse, the world reacted with fury and awe. The public, once skeptical of Martha, now hailed her as a woman of strength and dignity. People on the streets held signs of support. Strangers reached out with words of kindness, and the media flooded headlines with her story. From maid to mother figure, Martha Johnson's story of love and justice. Billionaire falls, truth rises. Child's courage breaks chains of power. Martha had entered that courtroom as an accused criminal. She left it as a symbol of hope. Weeks later, the storm slowly began to settle. Charles faced investigations, his business empire crumbling under scrutiny. Lily was placed into protective custody, and after a long legal process, Martha was granted guardianship. The first night Lily stayed in Martha's small, humble home, she curled up beside her on the couch, her teddy bear tucked under one arm. This feels like home, Lily whispered, her eyes closing. Martha wrapped a blanket around her, her own heart full for the first time in years. That's because it is home, baby. As she watched Lily drift into sleep, Martha realized that though the road had been painful, it had led her to something beautiful. She had not only cleared her name, she had gained a daughter. Martha knew her story wasn't just her own. It was a story for every person who had ever been silenced by power, for every worker wronged by the wealthy, for every child who feared speaking the truth. Her story carried a message that even in a world tilted in favor of the powerful, truth could still rise. Courage could still break chains, and love could still triumph over lies. The one evening, months later, Martha stood in a park with Lily. The child laughed as she ran through the grass, her laughter free, unburdened. Martha watched her, tears of joy in her eyes, the sound like music to her soul. Lily ran back, wrapping her arms around Martha's waist. Do you think people will forget what happened? She asked softly. Martha knelt down, cupping her face. Maybe one day, but what matters is this. People will always remember how brave you were, and I will never forget how much I love you. Lily smiled, leaning into her embrace as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Martha whispered a prayer of gratitude, from maid to accused, from accused to vindicated, and from vindicated to mother. Her journey had been painful, but it had ended in redemption, and as she held Lily close, Martha knew one unshakable truth. Wealth and lies may crumble, but love and truth endure forever.